let's pause here. And since this series I'm doing is kind of amounts to a Consciousness 101 series, let's pause and situate you in the taxonomy of ideas about consciousness. I think you may be somewhere near a lineage that I would say, Gilbert Ryle fits into. And in any event, his student, Dan Dennett, who doesn't, well, let me give you my, I don't understand this stuff very clearly. Let me give you what I kind of think is the case. So Gilbert Ryle wrote, if he did nothing else, if his views of consciousness turn out to be totally wrong, he still gave us a great phrase, the ghost in the machine. and I haven't read the book. It's the title of a book, right? He's a British philosopher from, I don't know, 70 years ago. What's that? It is
the title of the book is The Concept of Mind.
Okay, right. And the phrase, the ghost in the machine, is in that book. And I take it, well, he was ridiculing conventional ideas of consciousness, and I take it the idea was, if you have a machine that works, you don't need a ghost, kind of. I mean, it's like, and in any event, I take it that he thought that our conventional, that our conception that consciousness is a thing was a kind of a confusion that was a product of the way we use language, and so I take it that he would say consciousness doesn't exist. In any event, that view is known as behaviorism in philosophy, the view that consciousness just doesn't exist. I think he's somewhere in that vicinity, and I'll pause and let you correct me, but first I want to say that then Dan Dennett is his student. Dennett definitely does not explicitly say consciousness doesn't exist. When I read him, I think his view amounts to that, so far as I can tell. And when I say that to him, he gets really upset. So he's definitely doesn't want that said about his view, that he's just denying the existence of consciousness. And by the way, we'll link to a long conversation I had with him years and years ago that's on video about this. But anyway, why don't you correct what I got wrong by way of, in the name of kind of situating us in the taxonomy of ideas here.
Well, I don't think you've got anything fundamentally wrong there. I mean, Ryle's opposition, I take it, was not just to it being a ghost in the machine, but to the idea of the mind being a machine at all.
Okay.
So, for him, when we talk about people's minds, this is caricaturing, we are talking about collections of dispositions, how they're disposed to behave. That's right. Form of behaviorism, though it's not wise to put simple forms of behaviorism on Ryle, but
So can I just pause and say then his use of behaviorism had a connection to the use in psychology. In psychology, behaviorism refers to a reluctance to even talk about what's going on inside the mind, so to speak, and an insistence on focusing just on the behaviors that result.
It's certainly got a connection, but it's a different thesis. I mean, the thesis in psychology is more methodological principle.
Right.
There's no methodologically sound way of sort of getting at anything that's going off inside.
Right.
So
all we can observe is the behavior, and if we're going to do science, you have to confine yourself to what you can observe.
It has to be objectively
right.
observable. It has to be available to publicly available, and the stuff inside isn't so. I mean, you can then go on from that to say, well, the stuff inside is kind of not relevant to talk about the mind at all. Mm-hmm. So there's a methodological principle which says just steer clear of it because you're not going to make any progress with it, and then there's a stronger principle which I suppose says no, when we talk about minds, we are just talking about observable behaviour, that there isn't anything going on inside that's relevant. There's all sorts of neural stuff going on there, but that's not relevant to mentality as such, except as some sort of base for it at a low level.
Okay.
It probably has to go on in order for there to be a mind, but the mind isn't that stuff inside. It's the manifest dispositions. I guess that's the sort of thing. Though, particularly with Ryle, it's unwise to pin. I'm not a Ryle scholar, but I know people who are Ryle scholars often object to crude caricatures of his view. But anyway, that will do as a starting point at least. And yes, Dennett was Ryle's pupil, and he's kind of so that's certainly a huge influence on his thinking. But I mean, he's also much more interested and much more knowledgeable about contemporary cognitive science and about the stories about what is going on in there. And so I think his interest really is how there can be stuff going on in there, inside, that produces behavior of the kind that we describe in mentalistic terms? How is it that, so really when we talk about people having minds, we're talking about them displaying these really complex patterns of behavior. And the question is, how does the stuff in there manage to produce those really complex systematic patterns?
By which they don't just mean how the brain produces them?
Oh yes, how exactly.
They do.
But what he would resist, I think, is the simplistic idea that you project back these everyday mentalistic categories, you project them into the brain. That because we talk of people having beliefs, there are therefore some things in their head that can be identified as beliefs.
Okay.
There are things in their head that can be identified as intentions, and indeed, I guess, as consciousness. This is a way of talking we have, a way of talking about ourselves and each other, which is incredibly useful and practically indispensable. You can't even articulate a sort of skepticism about this kind of view without using the concept. But to that extent, to the extent that what we're doing is using it to sort of characterize each other's behavior and our interactions with each other, it's perfectly sound and it's real. I mean, these patterns in behavior are perfectly real. What then it is suspicious of is the idea of projecting these things internally to look for these mentalistic states, look for entities corresponding to these mentalistic concepts in the head or indeed in the soul.
Well, those are kind of two different things. I mean, if you mean that a neurologist is not going to be able to point to something in the brain that is a belief, that seems fair to say, at least in any kind of straightforward sense, like there it is right there. You know, obviously a belief would be the product of some kind of complex physical information flow in the brain that's probably distributed across areas and is hard to pin down, so on. But it's a separate.
Well, there is a real issue here. I mean, some identity theorists would actually say that. And yes, it's not.
And let's define that. So, mind-brain identity theory is. Does that correspond to either Dennett or Ryle, or that's the view that to me I think is close to the view that consciousness doesn't exist. But in any event, it's the view that consciousness just is the brain, right? Not that there's just a correlation, but that it is the brain, right?
Okay. Well, certainly, Ryle, Dennett, myself. Practically everyone who calls himself a physicalist, and indeed people who don't call themselves physicalists, will have to say there's nothing more than the brain. There isn't a soul in addition to that. There's the brain, there's the working brain, and that's it. The major debate, including among people who don't describe themselves as physicalists, is whether the brain has non-physical properties, in addition to the sort of properties that can be described by the physical sciences, by chemistry, biology, the cognitive sciences generally. So in that nothing over and above the brain sense, then pretty much everybody thinks the mind is no more than the brain. But then there were questions about how far. Let me introduce a term: folk psychology.
Okay.
Okay, so that's our everyday way of understanding each other in psychological terms, in terms of having beliefs and desires and intentions, hopes and fears and perceptions and experiences and consciousness, and all this rich variety of psychological language, mentalistic language that we use in everyday discourse. And we use it to explain and predict our behavior, to coordinate our behavior, to understand. It's absolutely central to all human interaction. And one of the big questions, perhaps the central question for contemporary philosophy of mind is, how should we understand that vocabulary, that conceptual apparatus? Is it just a sort of useful way of coordinating our activities with each other and a rough and ready way of predicting how people are going to behave? Or does it contain elements of a sound psychology, a sound science of the mind? Is the mind really divided up into beliefs and desires and intentions and hopes and fears and perceptions? Are these real states and processes?
So is the actual functional workings of the mind the way the functional workings seem to be to us from the inside?
Exactly. And some forms of identity theories will say, yes, you can identify each of these states with a certain kind of functional component of the mind. Like a perception is some sort of is a sensory input of some kind that contains perceptual information, perhaps of an analog kind, which then feeds into concept-forming mechanisms, and you can identify it by its modality and so on. And you can actually expect to look for and find patterns of activity in the brain that correspond to particular perceptions, to particular activated beliefs and desires and so on. So obviously these are not going to be very discrete and localized, as you say. They'll be distributed, but should be able to identify
something corresponding,
something discrete corresponding,
right. Which I would certainly expect, and any behavioral scientist would kind of expect, right?
Not well. It's a reasonable hypothesis. It's a reasonable way to go. This sort of folk psychology seems to work incredibly well, and it's reasonable, at least a reasonable hypothesis that it's describing reality.
And it even kind of maps on to evolutionary theory in a rough way, right? You can say, well, what is the function of this kind of fear? What is the function of fear, period? And what is the function of this kind of fear? And what is the function of this kind of belief about a rival and so on, or a friend, and you can, so it kind of seems to make sense, but go ahead.
And indeed, a lot of theorists draw on evolutionary considerations in developing accounts, say, of mental representation, for example, of how these bits of the brain get to represent bits of the world in terms of their function. So yes, their design function. But it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, for example, a lot of work in connectionist modeling of the mind, of memory, really doesn't picture memory as working in this kind of way, and because you have, I don't know if I should say about connectionist.
People should imagine like a distributed system, a bunch of nodes where information is stored in patterns of connection among nodes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that happens there is that if you think of a retrieval of bits of information from this interconnected network of nodes, there's no way of sort of just activating one bit of that network. The whole thing gets activated, and then you get particular outputs. But there's no way, and so an output here might correspond to a response, say classifying something as belonging to a particular kind. But there's no way of saying that a particular bit of information got activated, or at least arguably there's no way of saying that a particular bit of information, there's a pattern of activation across the whole thing which results in an output. So in a way, every bit of information is sort of active. Every node is active in every computation. So you can't localize bits, individual beliefs and desires, and you can't say when a response was generated it was the product of one particular piece of information being activated as opposed to others. It's a holistic process of retrieval.